Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to the Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Lustig. We're delighted that we're able to join you this evening. I hope you got a chance to be outdoors on this magnificent day. And we're delighted to have join us Kenneth S. Stern. It is popular to talk about the Hillel statement, if I'm not for myself, who am I? If I'm only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? In fact, I used this in a large, on a high holiday sermon on anti-Semitism, talking about our need to stand up for ourselves. But we have to ask the question, when we look at this, how should I stand up for myself? When should I stand up for myself? And the context of what happens. There's no greater question that comes to my office in the fall or spring. In the spring, it's people who visited a particular campus and people asking me about what is the history or experience of students on that campus in terms of their anti-Israel rhetoric, or the experience of students. Do they feel shut down? And then in the fall, the call comes that my child had made a great choice that we thought was for a great academic experience, and they're feeling totally intimidated. On a morning in which I was to speak with at Cornell University for an alumni weekend, on that alumni weekend, they have a very interesting council at the school of all the different religious faiths come together, and they have a council where they deal with all sorts of issues. To the surprise, the Jewish students felt very betrayed when they woke up in the center of the campus. There had been tombstones set up as a protest with the names of Palestinian children that they had said had been murdered by occupied forces. This is something that plays out in our college campuses, but we need to put it in the context of what the purpose and understanding of the college campus is, and the purpose and understanding of what free speech is and an academic freedom. And nobody is better at doing that than our speaker this evening, who's written a fascinating book called The Conflict Over the Conflict, the Israel-Palestine Campus Debate. Kenneth Stern is the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, an attorney and award-winning author. He was the American Jewish Committee's expert on anti-Semitism for 25 years. He's argued before the United States Supreme Court, testified before Congress, and was invited presenter at the White House Conference on Hate Crimes, served as a member on the US delegation to the Stockholm Forum on Combating Intolerance, and was part of the defense team supporting Dr. Deborah Lipstadt in her historic London Holocaust denial trial. Stern also trial and appellate counsel for the American Indian Movement and co-founder Dennis Banks. He has appeared on on almost every news agency and every newspaper. His definition for anti-Semitism has changed in many ways the approach to the way we deal with anti-Semitism locally and internationally. He has written an incredible book that I encourage you to read. One of the most respected college professors, and I was one of my teachers, Dr. Jonathan Sarna, has stated that this book should be required reading for all faculty members at universities, and most importantly, for all freshmen. What I appreciate so much is that Ken steps back and lays out an incredible case for our understanding and looking at what goes on from both sides. He uses both psychology, he uses case study, and he uses just common sense for us to look at this situation and to say, whoa, let's think about what's happening here. And he gives a great outline in the end of his book about a blueprint for how we should approach it. It is my delight to present to us our Amram Scholar Series this morning, brought to us by the Jewish Book Council. I also want to thank Leslie Maitland, who has heard Ken and brought him to our attention. And without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Stern.
Thank you, Rabbi Lustig. Actually, Dr. Stern were both my parents. I'm just Mr. Stern, but thank you for the kind introduction in any event. It's my pleasure to be with you. I am delighted to have this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about not only the book, but the ideas that the book addresses. What I'm going to do is talk for about a half hour or so, and then engage your questions in any direction you want to take them. There's a lot of meat in the book, as you'll hear, on different issues in terms of how we understand anti-Semitism, how we talk about Israel, why it's such a difficult conversation to have, and I'm happy to take whatever questions you'd like. So, what the major issue here is precisely that: why it's so difficult when we think about the conflict and how do we approach it on the campus? How is it possible to have rational discussions? And really, why it's so difficult to do so. And I'm going to, in the course of my overview, I'm going to talk about some of my personal history, some stories, some principles, and as Rabbi Lustig said towards the end, some best practices. And I want to start at and begin and end actually at the same place the book starts, in the town of Spokane, Washington. And some of you may remember back in the 80s and 90s, there was a neo-Nazi group that was Holocaust denying, Hitler worshiping, and one of the greatest sources of domestic terrorism in the US, called the Aryan Nations. It was responsible for a group called the Order that assassinated Jewish talk show host Alan Berg. It had a member named Buford Furrow, who you may recall in 1999 went to the Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles and shot it up, wounding 3 children, and then killing a Filipino postal worker. I was friends and have been friends with the various different rabbis in Spokane over the years. Occasionally I'd hear stories that were probably linked with the Aryan Nations and didn't make the newspaper, like people going and shopping in the few stores that had Hanukkah gift wrap, opening it up and finding razor blades inside. The Aryan Nations pipe bombed the house of a priest that was speaking up when members of the Jewish community in particular were getting vilified. Thank God he was okay, because he was inside the house when the pipe bomb went off. So you can imagine what it was like living in that community in Spokane in the northern panhandle of Idaho. So in 2001, the compound was shut down by a suit brought by the Southern Poverty Law Center and a local attorney named Norm Gissel. But a lot of the reason that everything was successful in finally shutting the Aryan Nations down was that the local peace and justice groups and the local Jewish community were working together. Um, and the threats didn't stop after the Aryan Nations was shut down. I was in Spokane for a conference, obviously pre-COVID, a couple of years ago, and still seeing white supremacist stickers on the lampposts downtown. A few years ago, there was a Martin Luther King Day parade, and thank God it was discovered a backpack that had a pipe bomb and a radio-controlled, remote-controlled explosive. And inside the pipe bomb were fishing weights soaked in anticoagulant found in rat poison. There were kids on that march. Imagine if that had gone off. So the threats were real and continue, but for about 8 years, from around 2000 to 2018, the Jewish community and the Peace and Justice Group weren't talking to each other, wouldn't even be in the same room, wouldn't be parts of the same coalition. And what was the reason for that? It was that the Peace and Justice Group had a static page on its website in favor of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement against Israel. Jewish community was calling them anti-Semites. And if you step back and think about this rationally, neither the Peace and Justice Group nor the synagogue and Jewish community in Spokane were going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict. But they certainly had an interest in working together when somebody across the street may be planning, to murder somebody in the community. But they weren't. That was nuts, right? So that's where I start, and I'll come back to that story at the end of my talk. In terms of my personal background, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s in New York, involved and concerned about issues of civil rights, and the Vietnam War and so forth. And I moved to Portland, Oregon. I went to law school in Oregon and ended up started a practice where as Rabbi Lustig mentioned, I was a lawyer for one of the co-founders of the American Indian movement in one of the last post-Wounded Knee trials. I represented one of the last Vietnam era protesters, represented the homeless. So I was very involved in the progressive community, both as an activist and as a lawyer. But Portland then is now had not only this sort of progressive aspect, it also had a far right aspect. I would run into members of a group called the Posse Comitatus, which I profiled in my book about the Oklahoma City bombing. They were a precursor to the militia groups. And, you'd see these folks handing out leaflets with talking about the Jews are a cancer in society. They secretly control everything with, they would back it up with fraudulent quotes attributed to Benjamin Franklin or George Washington. In other words, they saw the world through the lens of Jewish conspiracy, and that was a concern for me. What happened was that in 1982, when the Lebanon War started, I was joining some of the protests. I thought it was an ill-advised war. But what happened was I started seeing people who were ones I would work with on these other issues, homelessness or the American Indian movement and so forth, repeating things about Jewish conspiracy related to things in the Lebanon War that were not all that different from what I was hearing from the Posse Comitatus folks. So that was an eye-opening thing to me, and I started struggling about how do I deal with that? How do I understand it? How do I address it? And I started writing for local progressive papers and others, and I think I was really only convincing myself. I was angry, I was frustrated, I was disturbed, distressed, but I didn't think I was convincing anybody. There were some people take me aside and say, well, you may have a point, but you're harming the Palestinian cause. In other words, so people didn't want to engage us, and I really was looking at how to have that conversation in a way that was productive. In some ways, this book is an answer to what I was struggling with back in, almost 40 years ago now, as hard as it is to believe. So between 89 and 2014, I manned the anti-Semitism desk at the American Jewish Committee. I was the in-house expert. And one of the first things that I was asked to do was to look at the issues of bigotry on campus, including anti-Semitism. But again, that was a hot topic back in the late 80s and early 90s. You may recall, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute. It was the era of the proponents of pushing hate speech codes on campus as a way to deal with disturbing things. And so what I wanted to do was to find ways to help colleges navigate this. And one of the first things I realized is if I'm talking about special rules just for the Jewish community, it wasn't going to go into place. The campus had to see things that I was proposing that they do differently as ones that would benefit everybody in the campus and be part of the campus culture, not seen as protection for a particular group. So if you want structures, the structures have to address racism, sexism, homophobia, and so forth. So what I did is I went down, this is again, so long ago, you guys would remember, you couldn't do the research on the internet. There was no internet. I went down to a group in not far from DC called the National Institute Against Prejudice and Violence that had a file cabinet through clippings about disruptions on campus around all sorts of issues of bigotry, copied a lot of things, went back to New York, met with a lot of different college presidents and other stakeholders, and then ultimately came up with a manual about how to deal with bigotry on campus and training over 200 college presidents. And some of the things that I learned in that process are just as relevant today. First, the call for hate speech codes, aside from its legal problems, which I can address if people are interested, there were practical problems with them too. Just to give you one example, the University of Michigan had one that I thought was really Talmudic in its analysis of the situation. Because it said, okay, let's have a code that prohibits speech, but on campus we have a classroom that ought to have a different interest in speech than a dining hall, than a dormitory, which is more like one's home. Um, and so they had different rules from different venues on the campus. And the students did what I thought would be an appropriate thing, is find the intersection, take chalk and write free speech zone there. Because a lot of these incidents happen at 2 o'clock in the morning with a drunken student, and they're going to think, where am I on campus and what can I say? But the reality was, this was a way for administrators not to do the hard work. It was a way for them to say, oh, we have a rule. The rule says one can say this, one can't say that. And that's how we're going to deal with it. When the problems were much deeper, the problems went to, how do you think about surveying students to really understand what they're feeling in terms of their day-to-day experience on campus and the bigotry that they might experience. Looking at courses, looking at training of staff, and so that the few black students don't get always stopped by the police, campus police, and so forth. There were a whole bunch of things that really would address the issue, and all those went by the wayside when you had a simplistic legal answer that this is what we're going to do. We have a code that looks at speech. All those other things disappeared. So the other thing I learned in the process of putting that report together is that anything that one proposes on campus in this whole range of issues has to underscore free speech, the importance of free speech, and the importance of academic freedom. If they don't, they're going to be targets for people who are going to change the subject from the bigotry to ones about what speech is about and what speech is allowed and so forth. And what you want to do is at least be neutral about those things, not harm academic freedom and free speech. And the capacity on the campus to promote those things is real and will help in this battle. So let me flip forward a little bit. Post 2000, there was the beginnings of the Second Intifada. There was the World Conference Against Racism in Durban in 2001. That was a blatant orgy of anti-Semitism, let alone of anti-Israel animus. And I have a chapter in the book that goes through what happened at Durban. But one of the things that Durban was supposed to do was to launch an effort to brand Israel as the functional equivalent of South African apartheid and dismantle it. And so you may recall that right after Durban ended, there was, of course, the attacks of September 11th. So the plans got pushed back a little bit. In 2002, in February, you started seeing petitions on campus calling for divestment from Israel. But what's really interesting, to give this some perspective, is this is 19 years ago. How many campuses have divested from Israel? The answer is zero, none. There have been some student resolutions, a small number over the years calling for that, but no campus has divested. And it's an important thing to put in perspective. Also, at the time when they started calling for it, the people that subscribed to it were much lesser in number than the counter divestment petitions, which included a lot of alumni. I have data in the book that shows that most campuses, really, Israel is not an issue. There are 4,000 college campuses in the United States, give or take. Last year there was data, there was 149 had anti-Israel programming, which is a minor percentage, although there's some of the more elite schools, And every year, consistently, the pro-Israel programming on campus outnumbers the anti-Israel programming 2-1. There have been disruptions of pro-Israel speakers. I find one disruption to be too many. It's, to me, a violation of academic freedom. But if you look at the numbers, between 2010 and 2019, there were 117 disruptions, and all but 16 of the programs were able to be completed. And that those 16 where they were not able to be completed were limited to 12 campuses. So there are issues, but it's not as ubiquitous as sometimes people paint. So let me jump back with that a little bit of perspective to, to look at the climate, go back to the lessons from 2002, because there were some disturbing instances. There was an attack on the Hillel building, a brick thrown through a window, if I recall correctly, in Berkeley. There was a riot in Concordia in Canada where Netanyahu went to speak. And it was frightening. I mean, it was disgusting, and it was, like I said, incredibly violent. This wasn't just speech. So what happened? I worked with a bunch of college presidents, some Jewish, some non-Jewish, to put together a statement. And I got over 400 college presidents to sign on to the statement. And what it did is it basically called out these instances, attacks on Zionists, basically. I mean, used the word in the statement and in the ad. And it's underscored the importance of academic freedom and saying that as college presidents, we have an obligation to keep a campus open to ideas and to stop harassment and intimidation. So in other words, it framed their statement around the importance of academic freedom. Let me skip forward again to 2007. You may recall that was the year that there was a group called the University and College Union in the UK passed a resolution that was supportive of an academic boycott of Israel. Now, to me, the academic boycott is entirely anathema. One can't boycott an academic because of their nationality or the connection to a particular country's institution. The whole reason for having the academy is to look at ideas and to examine ideas and not to blacklist them because they come from a particular country. But what was the initial reaction of some in the Jewish community, including the ADL, which I've worked with and respect and have close friendships with people who are still on staff there. But the initial reaction was, gee, maybe we should do a counter boycott of British academics. And think about that for a second. I understand the anger, I understand the frustration, but if academic boycotts are anathema, then you're changing the subject to saying, okay, academic boycotts aren't anathema. Let's have a discussion about who should be boycotted. Tactically, that was silly. Philosophically, I thought it was wrong. And I can tell you there would not have been one college president in the United States endorsing the idea of let's boycott British academic unions, British academic institutions. But what I was able to do, and I outlined the story of this in the book, is work with Lee Bollinger, who's the president of Columbia, who's written extensively about academic freedom and free speech. And he put out a statement that said that if the University and College Union was intent on going down this road, which he found it to be obviously ill-advised and a violation of academic freedom and so forth, then if they were intent on dividing the academic world into two, Israelis who should be shunned and everybody else, he said, count Columbia as an Israeli academic institution. Treat us the same way. If we're going to divide the academic world in this way, we're on that camp. Got 400 other college presidents more to sign on to that too. And I have to tell you, it's very difficult to get college presidents to sign. They want to co-author something. They want to put in their own words. They don't want to be seen as signing on to somebody else's. And there are a lot of institutional pressures not to do that. But we got over 400 college presidents to sign on. Why? because the statement underscored the importance of academic freedom to the campus. And that's why they were able to take a stand against this, ill-conceived boycott of Israel. I want to spend a few minutes, because I know this is a hot issue, and it's one I devote a chapter to in the book, about the definition of anti-Semitism, the history leading up to the executive order, and why, despite the fact that I was the lead drafter of it and still find value in its use in particular settings, I am absolutely opposed to the idea of using it as a de facto hate speech code on campus. So let me walk you through how it was created and how, in my mind, it's been abused and the dangers from that. So, as I was mentioning, past the collapse of the peace process in the Second Intifada, we started seeing an uptick in attacks on Jews around the world, but in Western Europe, they spiked and they continued at a high level for a long time. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that had as its task, as major task, collecting data on hatred, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism, among others. And it put out a report in 2004 that was largely correct in looking at where the instances of anti-Semitism, and particularly the violent attacks, were coming from. But some were from the far right, some were from young Arabs and Muslims in France and so forth. But it pointed out a particular problem, which is that it had these data collectors in all these different European countries, and there was no common definition of anti-Semitism. So how do you tell somebody in Bratislava or Kyiv or Paris or London or wherever what to look for if there's no common definition? So what they did is they said, as an interim, as a placeholder, we'll come up with a definition. And the definition talked about anti-Semitism as a series of stereotypes about Jews, which to me intellectually was backwards. It's a reflection of what anti-Semitism is as opposed to its defining characteristics. But leaving that aside, I saw a political reason for why they were going down that road, because they basically addressed this question: what do we do if somebody in the streets of London, let's say, is attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli? Should that be counted as anti-Semitism, or should that not be counted as anti-Semitism? And they said, well, if the person harbored these stereotypes about Jews and applied them to Israelis and reapplied them to this person in front of them, that was anti-Semitism. But if they were upset at an Israeli policy or action and beat up the same Jew, lamentable but not anti-Semitic to be counted. And I thought that was nuts. I mean, again, as I said, I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I always think when I talk about bigotry and anti-Semitism, cut and paste it, look at it in a different situation and see what would happen. Imagine if somebody was lynched, a Black person in the 50s in the South, and somebody said this isn't racism because somebody was upset at a Martin Luther King speech or the passage of a Civil Rights Act. That would be nuts. Of course, he counted. And what happened was that the director of the EUMC was coming and speaking at AJC's big annual meeting in DC. And a couple of weeks beforehand, there was a firebombing of a Montreal Jewish day school. Thank God nobody was hurt, but it was in reaction to Israel assassinating a Hamas leader. Not anti-Semitism, according to this definition. So that gave the opportunity for me and my colleague Andy Baker, who did the politicking, I did the drafting, but to work with the EUMC along with some others to figure out a working definition, something that would both be applicable for the data collectors, to let them be bean counters and figure out what to include and exclude, and not walk into that problem. I still think it's a good definition. No definition is perfect, but it gives those guideposts. There were some examples about Israel in there correctly, holding all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of Israel, like the Montreal day school that was firebombed. But there were other aspects there too, things about double standards and about anti-Zionism which I will explain a little bit more. But those were things there not to label anybody an anti-Semite, not to say if you're an anti-Zionist, you're de facto an anti-Semite, um, not to say that if you don't call out Chinese violations of human rights, the same breath that you're doing, things about Israel, that you're an anti-Semite. I mean, nobody was saying when I was protesting for Soviet Jews, I had to also mention Tibet to be able to be credible. But there was a reason why we put those things in there, again, not to label anybody an anti-Semite, but we saw a correlation, not a causation, but a correlation, that when those types of statements were prevalent, particularly in the media, it was almost a graph that one could superimpose in terms of the number of attacks on Jews in the UK in particular. So there was an incentive. We're going to keep the temperature, take a reading over time and across borders. It was important to put some of the anti-Israel things in there because that was one of the things we wanted to keep track of. So that was the purpose and the scope of the definition. Then something happened in the US in 2010. The Department of Education issued what was called the Dear Colleague letter relating to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 mandates that colleges provide an environment that's not discriminatory, harassing, and so forth. I'll give you the language in a minute. But it was always a debate about whether Jews were included or not, because it didn't talk about religion. It talked about race and other characteristics. And the 2010 letter was clear and right. It said Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities should be protected under Title VI. So what does it mean? It says that harassment encompasses both different treatment and the existence of a racially hostile environment, meaning the offending conduct is so severe and pervasive that in order to continue their education, a student has to suffer an educational environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. So not just one comment, or it has to be a pervasively oppressive, harassing, intimidated environment. And it was a change that I applauded, I advocated, and I was able to use it for some Jewish high school students near Binghamton, where there was a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas on their backpacks and on their desks and rolling pennies down, and the school district did nothing. This was a great tool, got them to respond, because the possibility exists that if it's a Title VI violation, you don't do something to remedy and come to a conclusion, all your federal funding can disappear. But what happens? So this tool is there. The some groups on the Jewish right decide, aha, let's take this new tool, marry it to the definition, particularly the Israel examples, and allege Title VI violations when the definition is abridged. Now, some of these cases did talk about things that were not expressions, but actions, but they were replete with these types of allegations. So some of these talked about a program against the occupation as an example to support a Title VI case. Texts that were unambiguously one-sided and anti-Israel contained material defined as anti-Semitic by the definition. An instructor had clearly indicated her bias in an online syllabus, discriminating against students who did not agree with her anti-Israel bias. A program called Understanding Gaza was one-sided, and because it asked students to feel emotionally, intellectually, students to feel emotionally and intellectually threatened. Program called Arabs in the Holocaust, which claimed the creation of Israel was a tragedy for Palestinian Arabs, films, speakers, and so forth too. So those were all protected speech. They were all part of a campus environment to look at ideas, and all those lawsuits failed correctly. So what happened? Then these groups started pushing to have the University of California system adopt and apply the definition. It refused. It tried to seek legislation, um, which also failed. And then they used the executive order that said that they had to consider the definition in looking at a Title VI case. Now, what's interesting is that when I testified in Congress against the law that was being proposed that the executive order substituted for, it was interesting that a lot of mainstream Jewish organizations, I mean, AJC, ADL, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and also groups like Christians United testified in favor of this. Who was testifying against? The head of the Association for Jewish Studies, Pam Nadel, a Jewish studies professor, the president of America Penn, who's also Jewish, uh, me and some others. I mean, just taking the position that inside the academy, this is not the approach you want to take. The academy is a special place that needs to be protected. And the implications of applying the definition are incredibly clear. It has been applied in the UK. There was an Israel Apartheid Week. I'm no great fan of Israel Apartheid Week, but I think Jewish students can, who are pro-Israel, can survive on a college campus where some of their students, some of their colleagues have such a demonstration. What happened is that the definition was used to make it so they could not have the Israel Apartheid Week. And Simon Wiesenthal put out a press statement saying, "This is great. All colleges should adopt this and apply it." There are other problems with this type of approach, in my view, too. It propels the idea that Jewish students should be protected from hearing expressions, that they're fragile. It seems to me that you want a college environment, which is really a safe place to battle over ideas, is to learn how to be disturbed by ideas. I sent two kids through college not all that long ago, spent a lot of money. If they were not forced to deal with ideas that disturb them to their core, it was a waste of money. We're going to be disturbed by ideas for the rest of our lives. How do we not take the advantage of the college environment to do that? To say they're fragile and to be protected, to me, is doing these kids a great disservice. Um, the other dynamic that's clear to me, and Rabbi Lustig mentioned it in the introduction, is the first chapter in my book, to really give some insight into why this has become so contentious, and why we should take approaches that teach people how to deal with these difficult ideas, as opposed to try to ban them and censor them. So, as he mentioned in the introduction, I direct the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, and there's a lot from from hard science to social sciences to history, religion, other fields, that there's a lot of evidence that we see the world as as human beings, or animals in our background. Evolutionary psychology and so forth tells us um, that we see the world as an us and a them, where our brains are programmed to to see the world that way. And question and answer, if we want, I can go into some of the brain science. And but just take the point which I put in the book, that especially when there's a perception of conflict, we go into these buckets and feel really self-righteous about us and them, and them's a danger to us, and that's how we want to see the world. Certainty becomes very important in this dynamic. We want to feel certain and right. We don't want to open up the possibility that we may be wrong about something. We become more wedded to seeing the world in a black and white fashion. It becomes easier. One of the books I cite in that section is by Jonathan Haidt, teaches at the NYU Business School, social psychologist. He wrote a great book called The Righteous Mind. And one of the things that he talks about is when you see the world in this sort of moralistic way, in the us versus them dynamic, morality, in a sense, both binds people together and it blinds them to other arguments and other things. And just think about it, the in this context, there, think of the power of symbols. that play out in our lives that tie into this how we see the world in moral terms. Think of the battles we've had over the last year or two or three over this symbols of the Confederate flag, and how that resonates with people. Or think about it in the context of Israel Palestine, the Israeli flag. I mean, on the pro-Palestinian side, there are some instances, and I outline these in the book, where the flag has been ripped down. And there are some instances where pro-Israel Jewish students actually wrap themselves in the flag. So there's a deep dive in the book, which is, I think, useful for way outside of the context of Israel Palestine, but other hot button issues, abortion, immigration, and other things, into how we think and feel when when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice. And it gives examples of how, extreme this can be. With it gives examples in the book of each side basically calling the other side a Nazi equivalent. So, the answer to this is to really underscore the complexity and to underscore how we think about these things, and that the campus is an ideal environment to have these types of discussions. Um, so part of what I hope the message of the book is that we have to stop trying to censor others. The pro-Palestinian side should certainly not try to censor by disruptions and academic boycotts. And the pro-Israel side sometimes does by emails, phone calls, or in this case, what troubles me the most is the use of the law, to try to win this political battle. So what we want to do is embrace the complexity about it. I want to read you one short snippet to give you an example about what I mean from the book. So I write, consider again the claim that Israelis are settler colonialists. On July 4th, 2018, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel wrote to the Iroquois Confederacy Native nations from New York and Canada, urging them to boycott the World Championship of Lacrosse, a game natives invented and that Iroquois introduced into early American settlers, a game they continue to excel at and is important to their culture. The request stated in part, as indigenous peoples, we have both seen our traditional lands colonized, our people ethnically cleansed and massacred by colonial settlers. This year marks 70 years of Israeli dispossession of Palestinians, which began with what we call the Nakba or catastrophe. In the years surrounding Israel's establishment on our homeland in 1948, pre and post Israeli forces predominantly drove out the majority of our indigenous people of Palestine and destroyed more than 500 of our villages and towns. And I write, contrast this language with a passage of an essay by Judea Pearl, a noted academic and the father of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was beheaded by terrorists in Pakistan in 2002. Is it not surprising, Pearl wrote, that misrepresenting Israel as a, quote, white settler colonial society has become a cornerstone of BDS ideology and propaganda? He asked those who read such claims to, quote, ask themselves if they can recall any of the following. One case of white settlers moving into a country they perceive to be the birthplace of their history. One case of white settlers speaking a language spoken in the land before the language spoken by its contemporary residents. One case of settlers whose holidays commemorated historical events in the land to which they moved, not the lands from which they came. One case of settlers who did not name towns like New York, New Amsterdam, and New Wales. Israeli towns are not named New Warsaw, New Berlin, and New Baghdad, but after names by which those towns were known in ancient times. One case of settlers who narrated their homecoming journey for 80 generations in poetry, prose, lore, and daily prayers. And I write, the reality is that Israel isn't like settler colonial states in many ways, but in other ways it is. Proponents on each side seem blind to the complexities, choosing to highlight either the differences or similarities, depending on which better suits their black, white, good, bad, us, them argument, and perhaps, as Michael Hogg and his colleagues posit, depending on which one makes one feel more certain. The scholar Zeth Aziska says, quote, real history is the ability to navigate all these views at once. The rest is communal advocacy. So what I call for at the end of the book is that instead of trying to suppress you know, complex discussions, we encourage them. But we also need to teach more classes about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism historically is mentioned in Holocaust studies or a passing mention in classes on racism and so forth. I think it deserves much more treatment as an interdisciplinary subject. I've taught it a few times. I have a model class at the Bard Center for the Study of Speech website, if anybody's interested. I think the importance on campus of talking about free speech and the importance of it, and model the campus place as a place for difficult discussions, examining all views, not just the correct ones. I think we have to insist on, in these discussions about Israel and Palestine, fundamental empathy. How would you feel if you were born in different circumstances? I mean, some of us in the last year, especially after the murder of George Floyd, if we hadn't thought about what it would be like being a parent or a grandparent of a Black kid who has to worry about it, interaction with a cop, we did start having some more opportunities for that emotional empathy. I think that's important as an academic exercise as well. There are classes that would be wonderful. I'll give you an example about one which I highlight towards the end of the book. There's a, a class that's taught at the University of Maryland, where and I'm friends with one of the professors there who taught this class based on a model created by another professor named Natasha Gill. But it was interesting. I found out about it when there was a news story that said the head of the J Street student group. Whenever you think of J Street, it's a Jewish, mostly Jewish group. It's a Zionistic group, and the head was of the student group was Pakistani Muslim. That's an interesting thing. And I found out that Paul Sham, who was at Maryland, taught this young woman. And then I started looking, what was the class about? What it was a look at the conflict from the 1880s through the end of the 30s. So before the Declaration of the State, before World War II, before 67, before contemporary issues, it was the guts of the conflict between the Arabs and the Jews in Israel. And what it did is for half of the class, half of the time of the class, the students had to faithfully represent an historic figure who participated in the Peel Commission in 1936 and 37. You may remember that the Royal Commission sent Lord Peel when the Brits had the mandate. What the heck do we do with this problem? And they talked to everybody. And the kids in the class had to faithfully represent somebody, as didn't have to be great actors, but they had to do research and be that person. Amna Faruqi, the Pakistani Muslim student, spent 8 weeks in the skin of David Ben-Gurion. And when I talked to her about that, because of the dynamics that you want to give people roles as much possible against their type, she said, "You think that was weird?" I had an Israeli classmate who had to portray the Mufti, and as much of a difficult person he was in this role play, the guy on my side who played the Jabotinsky figure was much more difficult to deal with. So this was a way of using this history to get people to see the conflict in a much more complicated way and a much more realistic way. And Natasha Gill, the one who designed it and first taught it, said to me, the kids would come into the class saying, "Gee, this is great. Now we're going to figure out how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should have been solved." And they come out of it saying, "Gee, now we know 80 some odd years after the Peel Commission why it still hasn't been solved." No one on the campus is going to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, but it can be used very effectively as a vehicle for promoting critical thinking. So to conclude, let me go back to where I began, to Spokane. So what happened was that the former dean of the law school at Gonzaga, with whom I've worked for years and is a good friend and active in the peace and justice community, reached out to me and said, "I don't understand why the Jewish community is saying we're anti-Semites. I haven't seen anti-Semitism. We need a way forward." So what we figured out was a way to find the 40 people in the community, people from both groups, and the mayor, I tell you, and the police chief, and the head of the NAACP, and a bunch of folks to spend a day together um, in an off-the-record meeting where I made them promise to read about 80 pages of things that I gave them, including history of anti-Semitism, some of the things I mentioned earlier in this talk about hate studies, things about Israel and Zionism, and they had to engage this very, seriously, and with the understanding from the hate studies aspect and the understanding of of the history of anti-Semitism, they were able to have a productive conversation. Not only that, it allowed, they're still 3 years later, they're still working together. They have vocabulary for bridging their differences. It also opened up, there were some members of the Jewish community who were very much in the pro-Palestinian camp, who are now, welcome in the local synagogue where they didn't feel so welcome before. So it had a lot of positive impacts. And the two things that I took away from that day, which were reflective of what we can do if we start talking about these issues in a more rational way, is that one of the leaders of the Peace and Justice group, who was very active in that effort and supported the BDS efforts, came over to me and said, I never really realized the history of anti-Semitism and Jews being boycotted throughout that history, and why that resonates so deeply and disturbingly. And thank you for letting me understand that. And then there was somebody who's a very, strong AIPAC supporter, who came up to me and said, I had to think about it when you mentioned that. What I'd mentioned was I had been on a panel with a Palestinian academic who was supporting BDS, and I was arguing against it. And I said, whatever, one thinks about it, you have to engage. One thing he said, which was that back at the time of the Second Intifada, people like me were saying, find a nonviolent way to make your case. Whatever you think about BDS, it is nonviolent. And he understood that. So anyway, let me stop there and take your questions on any aspect of this that you find interesting.
I want to thank you for giving us this opportunity. And I want to start by, the book is, I think what's important about the book, and I know it's very hard in a 45-minute to an hour time to go through the dense opportunity, but this book is built sequentially in such a logical way where you start in talking about the natural human tendency, psychology, and all those things that underpin this, the us them issues. And you make a clear statement that we need to be careful not to, if you will, overreact to a particular situation, because often the alarm that we sound is actually bigger than the fire itself. And I think that it's very interesting that your statistics pan that out, because having read and reading some of the things that are inciting concern about these, you would think that it's a far greater impact than they've had. Given all of that, I think it's in chapter 5, and I can't remember, I don't know if it's Fred Gut, a South Carolina rabbi, I think it was referred to. There is the concern, and often I wonder how you address this, that, if we don't say anything, then, there's the problem that it almost legitimizes, and that saying that you don't have an argument against this. And I'm not talking about, the Palestinian part of this, but this idea of our reaction. So what is, in your mind, the way from where we clearly we need to, you're telling us first, we need to preserve the academic integrity, that the place of the university campus is where ideas should be expressed, and we need to do that in a free and open academic society. You're not saying that you're supporting falsehood or anything of that nature. Second of all, you're also have brought up the fact that that by doing this, I can't, was it Bollinger, the letter that was done by all the university was a very impressive way of dealing with this, because it gave voice to that. And you also tell them a little bit about the introduction that was done to the Iranian president, because I think that was a
Well,
beautiful point.
that's a funny story with that. Maybe recall Ahmadinejad, who was a Holocaust denier, was invited to come and speak at Columbia, and there was a lot of pushback about he shouldn't be allowed a forum. And Bollinger, I'm sure, did not want to have Ahmadinejad, who a college president wants to have his Surus, right? But the idea is that if the person is invited, an invitation is not an endorsement. Clearly, he represented somebody of stature and views that were not unique just to him. And so what Bollinger did is, again, there's a false dichotomy between not doing anything and allowing. I mean, what Bollinger said is, because we are allowing him to come, we have a responsibility to also say what we think in this context, to use it as a way to educate in the campus. And so he reached out to a lot of different people and said, what should I do? I mean, he really thought about it deeply. And one of the things I said to him is, well, everybody knows about Ahmadinejad's Holocaust denial. They don't know about perhaps some of his other issues, including his homophobia. So what happened is, at the question and answer period, because Lee had mentioned some of this, one of the questions was about gays in Iran. What an opportunity, because Ahmadinejad, I remember sitting there right across from the Iranian delegation. They were on the other side of the aisle. And Ahmadinejad, we don't have gays in Iran. And I'm thinking, does he mean that we killed them all, or doesn't really think that we don't have any? And the audience was sort of aghast at it. I still remember turning around and watching the audience, and this I didn't put in the book, but there was a student who was like, every anti-capitalistic, anti-imperialistic, anti-US thing that Ahmadinejad was saying, he was applauded. The anti-gay stuff, he sat silently. And then about 2 minutes later, when Ahmadinejad was back to the other things, he was applauding wildly again. But what happened was, this gave an opportunity for the cover of the New Yorker was a parody from this, a Saturday Night Live skit that was a parody of this. So it provided an opportunity. If people decide, okay, how do we deal with, if somebody's coming to campus, it's going to be a hateful speaker, how do we take this as an opportunity to turn it to our advantage? And if you make it just as, shall they speak, shall they not speak, you give away the whole opportunity that's inherent there, if you want to work at it.
And I brought this up because this was an opportunity. The way you presented that in the book was an opportunity to show that even though this happened, it wasn't the worst things that happened. The true colors of, in a free academic environment, showed itself, in that sense. So how should we respond to those who say, well, that you shouldn't you can't not say anything, because
most times I agree. I mean, the campus should be a place for discussion. So I think it's important for people to say what they think and to encourage an environment to have that type of discussion. But sometimes the instinct, and this happens on both sides of this conflict, is to shut down and try to censor the other side. So it's a false dichotomy. I mean, there are some times, and I have at the end of the book, there are some instances where strategically it's wiser to say nothing. And I tell the incident that Seattle had a anti-Israel group that was going to purchase, I think it was 12 bus ads for 2 weeks. And, so Seattle's not New York, but it's not a small city either. The ads weren't going to be seen, and they weren't, as bad as some of the other ones I saw over the years. And I advised some others that, let this one go, because you don't have to speak out every time, especially when we know, if you do, what's going to happen, what happened. They did. They called for the city to not put the ad on the buses. The ads were on the evening news. The ads were all over the front pages of the newspaper. So they were trying to deny them oxygen. They actually did the opposite. So sometimes some strategic thinking as opposed to just feeling insulated. But on the campus, there's so many, other things to do. And the Ahmadinejad story, the context of the where it fits in the book, as I was talking to a J Street audience that was concerned about some speakers coming to campus, and they were trying to push no platforming. I think to have Steve Bannon not be allowed to speak at the University of Chicago. And as much as I don't like Bannon, I was telling them about, well, they did the work. Here's the opportunity. Look what happened with Ahmadinejad. And I told them another story too, which is again not on the campus, but it has its application. You may recall a few years ago that the Jewish community in Whitefish, Montana, was getting threatened by neo-Nazis, and I was running a foundation then, working with a bunch of the local community, including the human
I
rights
love
groups.
this story.
And what we did is we didn't make a free speech issue. The guy was, they were going to have a march on Martin Luther King Day, armed, very threatening. And what we did is we used the internet. We created this model. It was called Project Lemonade. The people made pledges. If they showed up, the longer they marched, the more money people would give up to a limit. So what did it do? It gave a disincentive to the people to march. It gave an opportunity for the people in the community to feel that they were supported, and gave people outside, other than just bemoaning it, something concrete they could do. So I said, you don't want Steve Bannon to come on campus? Have him, the longer he talks, raise money for lawyers for kids that are in cages at the border. But there was no interest. The interest was really in trying to, no, it's verbal violence. We have to shut it down. I mean, one of the other things I go on in the book is the sort of culture about trigger warnings and safe spaces and microaggressions. And there's some, again, like most things, there's a little bit of logic to it. You don't want to be in a situation on campus where you're so uncomfortable and so oppressed that you can't say what you think. But when you start saying that here are the rules of one to guide what one can say, it basically says, here are the rules to define what one should think. And on a campus, you don't want to go down that rabbit hole of defining groupthink. You really want to encourage individual agency and having students figure out what do they think and how, if I'm wrong, how do I recalibrate my views as opposed to I'm just going to beat up the other side.
So, these are all, I agree in principle with this, but having been unfortunately in situations where the disruptions are, our own, we had a speaker, a Scholar Series speaker, not Scholar Series, a speaker that we hosted for Federation, who it was in fact in many ways pro two states, and he'd been a former military man, and he talked about improper use of military as opposed to proper use of military, and people hid inside of their clothes banners. And at a particular time, the deception, they pulled out these banners and started chanting down the individuals, which then, raises the temperature and puts everything at risk. And this is that there's not an opportunity in many of these cases. There's not an effort at all to even engage in dialogue. It's to simply shut down. And what are the proper response? I remember at American University, when Michael Oren spoke, he was very patient. He said, I'd happy to meet and speak with anyone, but if you think I'm wrong, then let's sit down and talk about it. But stood his ground, and these students just shouted and shouted and shouted.
Yeah, and as I highlight in the book, I find it's called a heckler's veto legally to stop somebody from speaking. I think that's more than a violation of the speaker's right. It's a violation of the opportunity of the audience to hear. And so I don't have a problem if somebody makes a 30-second thing and the speaker goes on. And I think the way to, again, it doesn't happen all that often on the campus. The Michael Oren incident at Irvine, I do cover in the book. But what should happen is that the university, in those circumstances, clearly define that no, there's a set of principles that actually come out of the University of Chicago that many schools have adopted that says this is not the way we behave at campus. Is a place for ideas. If you don't like the idea, speak up against it, but don't stop other people from speaking. But part of the problem goes back to the hate studies information I have in the first chapter. If you again think about it, if your mindset is that if somebody says this thing that's totally opposed to your belief system, that they're a Nazi equivalent, you don't have, sit down and have a cup of tea with a Nazi. You don't allow, they're beyond the pale. So instead of seeing the students as having a different point of view, or maybe they're come from a different belief system or different religion or different background or different presumptions, to define them as inherently evil and beyond the pale is the problem. And there's a push for that in terms of how we think when these become passionate issues to us. And part of the university's job, I think, is to underscore, even if you feel that way, this is not how you behave. And here's more opportunities to unpack why you may be thinking that way and how to have productive discussions.
So isn't the residual on the campus, or the effect is that then students, they listen, I'm not going anywhere near that. I'm not going to the Israel thing. I'm not going to go to the Hillel because I don't want to be attacked. I don't care enough about, Israel's not my thing. And so there is an effect on, and this is what I hear from my parents. I can't get, my child, I went there, they have a great Judaic studies department. My child says, I'm not going to take that because I don't want to be labeled. And that does happen on campus.
Not only does that happen, I mean, one of the things I outlined in the book in passing and mentioned in my congressional testimonies, there was a study from Stanford that basically said that Jewish students felt as they were crossing the threshold of a college campus to declare which side are they on. Are they on the pro-Palestinian side or on the pro-Israel side? And what was happening is a lot of students just said, if that's the price of admission to Jewish life on campus, forget about it. And so I worry about that in terms of its implications down the road for the Jewish community when we're saying you have to have the right values on issues of Israel, or you're going to be beyond the pale. And it's not unrelated to some of the legal concerns I have with the executive order and the push for legislation, because it's sort of a conundrum inside the Jewish community about where one's views about Israel lay in terms of how one defines who's inside the tent and who's outside the tent. So most people, I think, would take the position that Satmar Jews who are anti-Zionists are inside the tent. But there are some young Jews, some, if not now, and other groups, for whom, and anecdotally, some of them are very involved Jewishly, went to Jewish day schools and so forth, but they can't square their understanding of Zionism in Israel with their idea of how to treat the stranger in Judaism. So they do come to it from a theological perspective. And I don't know how that gets decided. What worries me is that by pushing some of this legislation, we're asking state legislatures and federal lawmakers to decide that question, because as Jared Kushner wrote in his op-ed supporting the executive order, it's now the policy that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. So if you're, a young Jew who has questions about Zionism, that says you're an anti-Semite. Do we really want to do that?
Well, and it becomes, it's echoed. We know that, the absurdity of the fact that, if you're in support of BDS or have written things in support of BDS, you're not allowed to speak in a federation's situation. So we had a Scholar Series young man who wrote a book about Hebrew University in which he and his wife were victims of a terrorist attack. And he writes about this, and he had made a statement earlier before he wrote the book, and he's not even allowed to talk about his book because of the policy. We have many national organizations have a love it or leave it policy. In other words, if you don't fly the flag and show you mentioned in, I think in one of either in an article or something of that, or even in the book, that if you were pressured at AJC, that if you didn't show up to the parade in support of Israel in New York,
Mhm.
you didn't go to the company picnic.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. There's that type of, but there's also, it's on the other side too. I mean, that to me is part of the tragedy, that if we play the game by the same rules that the people that are promoting some of the anti-Israel things on campus, it's the game we're going to lose, and they have an anti-normalization thing. So if you're in a group that's perceived as Zionist, they're not going. Some of the pro-Palestinian groups won't sit down and talk with you. And this is the flip side, saying, okay, on a campus, if we want to bring in somebody like the speaker you were talking about, or IDF soldiers who talk about what it was like to serve in the occupation and so forth, we're not going to allow that. And I understand that from an institutional point of view. I get it why funders say, wait a minute, why am I, going to fund in the Hillel somebody bringing up something that's negative about Israel that we know the people are going to take out of context and weaponize it? Why should I put my money to that? But the flip side of it is, you're again saying to young Jewish students, if you want to have these conversations, you have to go someplace other than the campus Hillel. And to me, that's a tragedy. Campus Hillel should be a big tent to allow all sorts of Jewish students in.
So let's turn, I have more questions, but I could monopolize your time the whole time. So if you have, I think there was a question in the chat from Paul Perlstein. Paul, do you want to just ask your question?
Well, I think the question was, can there ever be a real two-part solution with Palestine? And I kind of referred back smarmingly to Jericho and the Israelites. But is that even possible at this point?
Well, the book is about the conflict over the conflict rather than the conflict itself. So I don't know that it can, can it be solved? So, I mean, to me, that the two-state solution is the only option that I see as having any chance, because both people want to have national self-expression. And I don't see, Jews giving up that capacity, especially after having a state for 75 years. And I don't see Palestinians giving up a desire to have their national self-expression too. But I think people were a lot more optimistic at the time of Oslo than they are now, for a lot of reasons. So it's beyond my capacity to predict. All I'm saying is that at least when we're talking about it, we have to be open to understanding different points of view, to not assume that if somebody has an anti-Zionist point of view, especially somebody's a Palestinian or somebody identifies with a Palestinian in the Palestinian history, that it's because they're anti-Semites. There's certainly some anti-Semitism among some anti-Zionism, just like there's anti-Semitism among some Zionists. But when we make those simple black and white, good and bad comparisons, that's not helpful. So, and maybe having some better discussions, to see across the divide will help people come up with some better ideas of how to solve this.
Other questions from our audience, if anybody wants to share? Is it Lisa? Do you have a question? I see you looking like you're pushing your. Go ahead, Lisa.
I'm involved at the Literature, Science, and Arts Board at University of Michigan, and we go over a lot of these issues on campus climate and things you talked about, and academic freedom. And I loved hearing your talk. I didn't know it would go in the direction that it did, but I love the way you couched it, and I'm interested in reading your book and bringing it to the attention of people that I work with. But I can't see functionally how this works unless it comes from an institution down to the students. I don't, or unless you wonderfully find a way to embed this within student groups and organizations, but it has to sort of be embraced at the college level, dean's level, an organization that represents the campus itself, obviously a Hillel and another set, but I can't see this coming organically. This open intellectual discussion of such hot topics coming from Palestinian students, again, against Jewish students out on the open campus square.
Well, I can tell you that where there's a will, there's a way. I mean, at one college, there was a desire to have a discussion not identical, but not similar from the one I talked about in Spokane. So it was off the record, Chatham House rules. And it was a day and a half of deep discussion. And I was able to bring in to that some people who would not be normally in a room together. I won't give you names, but somebody who's academic, who's very strongly identified with the pro-BDS cause. And then I had the executive director of a major mainstream Jewish organization there as well. So it was a very broad and risky exercise for some of the people, but it was very productive in terms of helping cultivate an environment to have that discussion. And so again, it's a larger thing on the campus. Maybe it's easier in some ways for a campus like Bard that has a liberal education tradition, liberal arts tradition, where it comes down from the top, where it's very clear about how students and faculty ought to treat each other. And not to say there aren't people with strong views on this conflict. I know there are faculty who do one way or another, but they see themselves larger as part of the community. And again, it goes back to, I was talking about at the beginning, the thing I did when I started in AJC in the late 80s, early 90s on the bigotry on campus and convened the college presidents. It comes from the message of the college presidents first, I think. And one of the people who I worked most closely with, who died way too young, was Bob Hess, who was the president of Brooklyn College, a gem of a man. And he used to, talk again, he wasn't using the social psychology, which I have in the book, but in some ways he was. He talked about the myth of the institution. We're all Brooklyn College students. So what he was saying is that they had an obligation to their classmate that was right in front of them more than they did abstractly to what their imagination was of this people, these people thousands of miles away. And to the extent that you can inculcate that and the environment for valuing and cherishing difference of views, creating the environment where students know they can be wrong, they can recalibrate, and they're not going to end up on somebody's national blacklist, which happens with some of the pro-BDS students. They complain about this group Canary Mission that says you sign these different things, pro-BDS, and we're going to make it so your employers know and you never get a job. To the extent where you say that we're going to support our students, it's an excellent. It's also a book I would recommend. Jonathan Marks, who writes for Commentary. I wrote a review of his book, Let's Be Reasonable, Conservative Case for Liberal Education. And he makes pretty much the same point. I mean, I think he makes the case. I don't think it's a conservative case or a progressive case. The point is, campus is a cherished, important institution. Its job is to create critical thinkers, to challenge students' thinking, and to the extent that that comes down from the leadership and is in the classes and the surveys and the messages that come out consistently, the better we'll be able to achieve that goal.
Other questions? I can't see if there's something in the chat. Yeah, there is. Our college presidents stopping pro-Palestinian activities from shouting down pro-Israel speakers.
Yeah, there again, there's only been a limited number. I think it's 117, if I recall correctly, over that period of time. The college presidents have been, in my experience, very clear about the responsibility of allowing programs to go forward. And I know anecdotally, when there's at least a threat that something may happen, that you tend to see deans and college presidents and others at the forum to intercede and to cultivate that environment. So I think they do take this responsibility. But again, some paint this as a ubiquitous type of exercise. It's not. I think, again, one is too many. It violates academic freedom and free speech. But I think the college presidents are, at least in my experience, very strong on this.
So I want to ask you on a, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten the call saying that if you don't do something about this, rabbi, or if you're going to be that liberal idea, whatever, I'm going to pull my funding from the temple. And I'm sure that happens on the university campuses. Is I'm going to get all my alumni who are pro-Israel or pro-Palestine or whatever to pool their whatever. What is this academic pressure and this quote unquote financial leverage pressure do for us, and how is that perceived as well in the world of the anti-Semitic world?
Yeah, look, on one hand, people can give money to wherever they want or not give money. But that being said, there are challenges with that type of instinct. I tell this, the story. I got a call one day from a head of a federation in the Northeast at a significant university, who said the alumni were all ready to go and to push, to stop donating. And what was the reason? The reason was that they had started a new faculty education program. One of the co-directors was a person who was active in the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And they were just calling me up to check whether, in fact, the college president had signed on the Lee Bollinger ad. And I said, yeah, but, be careful what you're doing. Can you give me 48 hours to see what I can do about this? Because you're going to create an environment in which people that don't have any skin in this game are going to see this professor, if you're making the demand that he be removed from his post, as representing their academic freedom. And that's going to backfire. So, I did take the opportunity. I spoke with people in the administration and I said, look, I don't care if the president signed this thing or not. You can't enforce, a blacklist of Israeli academics. And I said, but on the other hand, if you think this guy is the best guy for this, you shouldn't be cowed into not supporting, that and going through with it. So, but what needs to be clear is that in this role, he's not going to discriminate and he's going to commit to that. So what it did is it put the guy in the bind. Do I want to make my buddies at the BDS campaign feel proud, or do I want to have this opportunity for academic advancement? He chose the latter. He put out a statement. And I went back to the Federation guy and I said, good. So now if you want, put some more money into the thing and give them some opportunities to say you're going to fund some people on the right spectrum, right of the Israeli Palestinian spectrum, Israelis, Likudniks and others to come and talk. So put the money where the mouth is. And that's a much better approach. Whenever you want to go down the rabbit hole of making a free speech fight, you're going to lose. It's much better to turn it around and use it to your advantage.
Very good. I had so many questions from the book, but I don't want to take people down other rabbit holes that they might not. Let me ask if there are other questions from our group. I'm going to really encourage people to take a look at this book. Ken, you did an incredible job. And I think that, you know, the layout of this book as it goes through, it's very clear, it's very concise. I think all of us should be, should read. There's I believe it's the second chapter, is it Zionism in 1948? It just giving comparative sorts of things and showing about what particular things we present and how those may be perceived. And it follows, you know, the chapter that talks about them and us and how we want to put those things in, because, you know, a quote from Herzl's diary can be certainly interpreted in a most horrific way. We know this in Bible studies and in proof texting, that when we look at the Bible and we think about, you know, what we stand for as reform and liberal and social justice Jews, we never talk about the end of the book of Genesis, in which, you know, Jacob's sons go out and slaughter all the people that the father has made a covenant with, and said, if you only circumcise your males, then by all means you can marry into our families. And the boys don't agree with it, and there's a mini genocide, if you will. And so, you know, we pick and choose. It's very careful of this, but what Ken, you've laid out in a really compelling way is that we need to, you know, stop, look, and think. We need to listen. We need to not overreact or knee-jerk react to a situation. We need to look and talk about what are our goals that we wish to achieve, and then we can't be scared of ideas. And if we shut down the university campus as a place where we can learn critical thinking and have open academic and free speech, then we've really done a disservice not only to Jews, but to the future of all free-thinking people. So this is an incredible book. We want to thank you for this opportunity. And I want to thank Shira for being our host tonight and doing things. I want to thank Leslie Maitland for for finding us the scholar and for engaging. And we want to thank all of you for participating. And we want to again thank the Jewish Book Council and Ken, a great job on this. Please continue to be an advocate for free speech and continue to make sure that we don't cross the line and do damage. And I thought your responses on the marrying of the definition, which is a brilliant definition, were done. And I just want you to know that I was, for the members of our congregation who are on this, this past a week ago tomorrow, I participated in the United Nations Alliance of Civilization, a forum on the holistic approaches to anti-Semitism. Malcolm Holine was a speaker. I was a speaker. Andy Baker, your co-author, was a speaker there from AJC. In addition, Jacob Isaacson was there, and a whole host of others participated in this. And uniformly, what they talked about in the appropriate way was that the definition that you crafted has been one of the best tools to make sure that there's a universal understanding of what is and isn't anti-Semitism. And the UN was very self-reflective of trying to clean up its own acts, 90 some odd sanctions against the state of Israel, 102 other things, and began to look in this sense. So you've done incredible work, and we're so proud of this. This book is a great book, and I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It is a book that any one of its chapters is an important read in and of itself. But the way they build together is beautifully done. So Ken, thank you so much. Regards to Margie, my fellow photographer rabbi. And we wish you well, stay safe, and thank you so much for this opportunity.